Over the past several episodes, we've been exploring the actions here at the Chickamauga battlefield, and we've been learning just how chaotic and crazy that this battle truly was. It seemed that if you weren't outflanked, you were in the minority. But within this battle are thousands and thousands of personal stories from the men who physically fought here. And today I want to explore some of those stories, and in turn, maybe we can gain a little bit better of an understanding about this battle. So let's see what we can learn. So we are in an area called Jay's Mill, and this is actually where the fighting kicked off on the morning of September 19th of 1863. You had members of the 10th Confederate Cavalry who were ordered on a recon mission towards the Lafayette Road, which is in this general direction here. So they would leave the area of Jay's Mill, enter the thick forest of Chickamauga here, where they would run into fresh Union infantry under the command of Colonel Croxton. And Croxton's men would deliver a point-blank volley to the members of the 10th Confederate Cavalry, and the remnants of the 10th Confederate Cavalry would begin pouring out of the woodline here, alerting the rest of the Confederate forces. Now, the 10th was part of Confederate Brigadier General Henry Davidson's brigade, and within Davidson's brigade, you obviously had the 10th Confederate Cavalry, you had the 1st and 6th Georgia Cavalry, and you had the 6th North Carolina, along with Rutgers Tennessee Legion. And they would have been positioned in this general area on the morning of September 19th of 1863. Now we're going to focus on a few men within the 1st Georgia Cavalry here. And one of those men was Benjamin Hunt, and the second was William Hunt, father and son in the same regiment, serving in the same company right here in Chickamauga. And as the fighting here intensified, Davidson would commit more and more of his men into the forest here. Well, the 1st Georgia Cavalry would be placed on the Reeds Bridge Road, just behind you on the camera here, and that's going to be our next stop. So Benjamin Hunt was 43 at the time of the Battle of Chickamauga, and William was just 17. The 1st Georgia Cavalry was placed along the Reeds Bridge Road and acted as skirmishers. Ferdinand Vandevier's Union Brigade would be moving down the Reeds Bridge Road and make contact with these Confederate skirmishers. The 1st Georgia had less than 300 men within their ranks, and now they were up against an entire Union brigade. As the fighting ensued, the 1st Georgia suffered 10 casualties, 3 killed, 7 wounded. Benjamin Hunt was one of those men severely wounded, and later on the night of September 19th of 1863, Benjamin would succumb to his injuries. Now on September 20th, William would bring his father's body home in nearly 42-mile journey. Benjamin would be buried in the family cemetery in Villanelle, Georgia. William would survive the war. Now, I don't know the proximity of William and Benjamin when Benjamin would be mortally wounded here. I don't know how close they were. All I know is that they were serving in the same company. But what I do know is, being a father, if I was engaged in a fight with my child in the same unit, the same company, I wouldn't be too far away. So there's a chance that William and Benjamin were in close proximity, where Benjamin was hit and mortally wounded here. Now, the fighting that started at Jay's Mill on the morning of September 19th of 1863 would continue to progress southward down the Brotherton Road. And the next spot for that fighting would be right here at Brock Field. And we're about to cover a soldier who was wounded here that probably, of all the soldiers who were wounded during the American Civil War, this one probably is the most unique. So by midday on September 19th of 1863, the fighting was escalating, causing both sides to commit more and more men. And the next phase of the attack was about to take place right here. In that woodline there was a massive division under the command of General Benjamin Cheatham, and his division was about to break through this portion of the Union line. Now, one of the regiments holding this area was the 9th Indiana Infantry, and within that regiment was a private by the name of Jacob Miller, who was a member of Company K. Now, Private Miller was 23 years old at the time of the Battle of Chickamauga, and he was a veteran, and his regiment would have been positioned somewhere in this area when the massive Confederate attack would start. Now, at some point in the fighting here, Private Jacob Miller was firing at the Confederate forces. His company commander, Captain McConnell, was standing behind him when a Confederate minie-ball would strike Private Jacob Miller dead center in the forehead. Now, after the war, Private Jacob Miller believed that there was a Confederate sharpshooter taking aim at his company commander, and he just happened to be directly in front of him. So somewhere in this field here, Private Jacob Miller was engaged with the Confederate forces, where he was the unlucky recipient of a Confederate minie-ball dead center in the forehead. Now, Cheatham's division would surge through this area, essentially driving back the Union forces holding this area. And Private Jacob Miller was thought to be dead. Remember, he just got hit in the head with a Confederate minie-ball somewhere in this vicinity here. So he was left for dead, most likely unconscious. So the men of the 9th Indiana and the men of Company K would pull back amidst this Confederate onslaught here. So the Confederate line would push through this area, and when Private Jacob Miller would come to, he realized that his comrades were driven back and he was all alone. So, determined not to become a Confederate prisoner, he would essentially get himself up using his gun as a crutch and try to make his way back to the Union line. Keep in mind, this man was just shot in the head. Think about the amount of pain he was experiencing. Think about this soldier being covered in blood, and now he has to find his way back to the Union line after they were just driven from this location here. Now, I've also read doing some research that Private Miller here would advance parallel to the Confederate line. So the Confederates essentially pushed into this wood line here. So he would go parallel to the line, trying to find his Union comrades here. And at some point, he would come across a Confederate soldier. And instead of capturing Private Jacob Miller, he gave Miller some water and even pointed Private Jacob Miller in the direction of friendly lines. And to me, that is just a little ounce of humanity amidst a sea of death and destruction here at Chickamauga. So I thought that was pretty neat, and perhaps maybe that action there is the reason why Private Jacob Miller survived the war. So at some point, Private Jacob Miller was able to make it to this general location. So Brockfield is in this direction, and he was able to make it to the area of the Kelly House, or Kelly Cabin as you can call it. And once he made it to here, he essentially passed out along the side of the road here. Now, Private Jacob Miller would be found on the side of the road, and he'd be taken to a nearby field hospital where he would begin to receive some sort of treatment. Now, surgeons there decided not to operate, and the following day, Private Jacob Miller would be evacuated to Chattanooga. It's really hard to imagine not only being shot in the forehead and surviving, but making it back to your own lines. And Jacob Miller's head was swelling so bad, he had to physically hold his eyes open just to see, more so on his right eye. So you can just imagine, you're full of blood. There's still battle raging around you, and he's pulling his eye open to try and make it back to the Union lines. And there's no doubt in my mind that that Confederate soldier that gave him that sip of water and pointed him in the right direction really helped Private Jacob Miller, and perhaps even saved his life. So we are positioned right now on Horseshoe Ridge. Now, this was the scene of some pretty heavy fighting on September 20th of 1863. And in this general area, the Union was beginning to make their last stand. The Confederate forces had broke through near the area of the Brotherton Cabin, and remnants of the shattered Union units would start forming along Snodgrass Hill here and along this line on Horseshoe Ridge. And Johnny Clem, along with 455 men, would charge up and over Horseshoe Ridge and would come into line of battle right here in this general location, essentially extending the Union right flank. Now, by 5 p.m., the 22nd Michigan had been fighting here for several hours, and men were beginning to run low on ammunition, and by 6 p.m., the entire Union force was beginning to pull back. And for whatever reason, the 21st Ohio, which is the monument in the distance there, the 89th Ohio, which is right here, and the 22nd Michigan, they never received word to pull back. Now, some accounts say the courier that was sent in this location was killed, therefore the message never reached this area. And I've also read that these 3 regiments were sacrificed for the greater good of the Union Army, so they continued to fight another day. So the men of the 22nd Michigan and our drummer boy, Johnny Clem, were left here to essentially hold out as long as they could. And the Confederates would launch their final assault just before nightfall here. Now, as the battle raged here, the 22nd Michigan, along with the 89th Ohio and 21st Ohio, would start to become encircled. And at some point during the battle here, Johnny Clem, with his sawed-off musket, so he can carry it easier, would essentially be confronted by a Confederate colonel. Johnny Clem not only shot and killed the colonel, he was able to successfully evade capture and make his way back to the rest of the Union Army here. For his actions, Clem was promoted to sergeant and would become the youngest soldier to ever become a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. After this action here, Clem would become known as the drummer boy of Chickamauga. So our final story here at the Battle of Chickamauga that I'm going to share with you has to do with the Angel of Maurice Heights. Now, you're probably wondering how the Battle of Fredericksburg and the Battle of Chickamauga are related, and you're about to find out why. Now, Sergeant Richard Kirkland was part of the 2nd South Carolina, which was part of Joseph Kershaw's brigade. And Kershaw's All-South Carolina Brigade would launch several attacks in this area, attacking the Union position here on Horseshoe Ridge. And in one of those attacks, Sergeant Richard Kirkland became isolated from his units. You can just see by the terrain here, it's really easy to not only become isolated, but this breaks up your formations. And when you're assaulting a Union position up on a ridge, it doesn't bode well for the attackers. So we're in the general area of the 2nd South Carolina as they made their assault on Horseshoe Ridge here. Now, at some point in the fight here, Sergeant Kirkland and 2 other soldiers became isolated from the rest of their regiment. Kirkland would quickly realize this, and they began working their way back to the rest of their regiment. But before they've made it fully, Kirkland would stop, turn back towards the Union line, raise his rifle to get in one last shot, where he was struck and mortally wounded by a Union mini-ball, somewhere in this area here. Now, it's hard to pinpoint the exact location where Kirkland was killed in action, but the 2nd South Carolina was coming through this general direction, and you can see the regimental marker here. So at some point during this fight, Kirkland became separated, and he would be killed somewhere just below the Union works here. And Kirkland's last words were, "There's nothing you can do for me. Tell my pa I died right." And that happened somewhere right here. The Angel of Maurice Heights, killed in action here at Chickamauga. I tend to find that when you come out to battlefields and you take the time to learn about the personal stories of the individual soldier as opposed to getting wrapped up in the tactics and movements of the armies, I feel like I tend to learn a little bit more. And you know, the more I do this and the more personal stories I learn, the more you realize these were just ordinary men who found themselves alive during a very, very difficult time in our country. And it's up to all of us to not only keep these stories alive so we can learn from them, but it's up to all of us to remember the past so we can live a better future.